My name is Madison Wright. I am 25 years old. Right now I'm sitting at the head of a mahogany table in a Portsmouth boardroom. Across from me, my father is sweating through his custom suit. He just pushed a piece of paper across the wood, offering me 50 cents on the dollar to settle a commercial lien I hold on his life's work. His hands are shaking. He thinks he is negotiating with a faceless corporate entity holding the keys to his financial ruin. He has no idea he is looking at his daughter. But before I tell you what happens when he realizes who owns this building, I need to ask you a favor. Welcome to Luke Vengeance. If you have ever been told you are not smart enough by the exact people who are currently begging you for money, please take a second to hit like and subscribe. Drop a comment below, letting me know your age and where you are watching from. I read every single one. Now let me take you back 3 years to the night the lights went out in Concord. I was 22 preparing for a master's program in applied mathematics. It was a Tuesday in January, the kind of New Hampshire cold that makes window panes rattle. My mother Sylvia was reading a catalog on the sofa. My older brother Julian was pacing the living room floor, talking on his phone about seed rounds and venture capital. Then the house went dark. The hum of the refrigerator stopped. Julian sighed and fumbled his way to the basement door to check the breaker panel. I listened to him flip switches in the dark for 10 minutes. Nothing happened. He came back up wiping dust off his designer sweater, saying, "The main fuse must be blown, and we need to call an emergency electrician." I walked past him. I went down the wooden stairs, smelling the faint trace of ozone in the cold air. I opened the panel, ran my thumb along the plastic housing, and found the tripped thermal relay he missed. I bypassed it and reset the circuit in 12 seconds. The lights hummed back on. Julian rolled his eyes and went back to his phone call. I closed the metal door and looked at the frayed wiring. The system was overloaded. It was going to burn down. I meant the house. I should have meant our family. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen counter with my laptop and a cup of black coffee. Tuition for my spring semester at Dartmouth was due by 5 p.m. I opened the browser and navigated to the state portal for my 529 college savings account. My grandfather opened that account the day I was born. For 2 decades, he deposited a portion of his pension into it. After he died, I added every paycheck I earned from working weekends at a local garage rebuilding engines. The balance the day before was $150,000. I typed in my password. The screen loaded. I looked at the bold black numbers at the top of the dashboard, $0. I refreshed the page. I logged out and logged back in. The screen remained unchanged. I clicked the transaction history tab. A single line item sat at the top of the ledger, dated 36 hours prior. Electronic transfer, out $150,000. It was authorized by the primary custodian of the account, my father. I did not scream. I closed the laptop. The smell of fresh coffee suddenly turned metallic in my throat. I heard my father's heavy footsteps coming down the stairs. The money was not hacked or lost in a banking error. It was taken by the man who was supposed to protect it. I walked from the kitchen into the living room holding my laptop. The air in the house was stale, trapped by the winter, sealing the windows shut. My father, Harrison, sat in his leather recliner, pouring amber liquid into a crystal glass. The ice clinked against the sides, a sharp, hollow sound in the quiet room. My brother Julian stood by the fireplace holding a sleek silver tablet. He was swiping through a presentation deck. The screen cast a pale blue glow across his face. He wore a crisp, unwrinkled button-down shirt. He had never worked a manual labor job in his life. I stopped at the edge of the rug. I looked at my father. He took a sip of his drink and let out a long breath of satisfaction. I turned the laptop screen toward him. I asked him where the funds from my 529 account went. Harrison did not flinch. He did not drop his gaze or stammer or look guilty. He set his glass on the side table with practiced, deliberate slowness. He looked at me the way a bank manager looks at a low-level employee asking about budget cuts. He told me he reallocated the capital. He used that exact word, reallocated. Like 20 years of my grandfather's savings and my own grease-stained paychecks were just numbers on a corporate spreadsheet he had the right to erase. Julian chimed in without looking up from his tablet. He said Vanguard was entering a critical seed phase and needed liquid assets to secure office space in Boston. Vanguard was the name of his startup. It was an app that promised to integrate lifestyle synergy for digital creators. If those words sound like meaningless corporate filler, it is because they were. There was no product, there was no code, there was just a logo. Julian paid a design firm $40,000 to draw and a presentation deck full of charts pointing up. I asked my father how he could authorize a withdrawal intended for my Dartmouth tuition. I was the beneficiary. Harrison scoffed. He picked up his drink again. He told me he was the primary custodian and he had the legal right to move the money to a different investment vehicle. Then he did the one thing that proved exactly how little he respected me. He complained about the cost of stealing my future. He leaned back in his leather chair and rubbed his temples. He told me the IRS hit him with a heavy non-educational withdrawal penalty, 10% off the top, plus state and federal income taxes on the earnings. He lost over $30,000 to the government just to pull the cash out. He looked me in the eye and said it was a brutal tax hit, but sacrifices had to be made for a high-yield venture. He was willing to set $30,000 on fire just to hand the remaining balance to a son who had never generated a single dollar of profit in his life. My mother, Sylvia, walked into the living room carrying a tray of sliced fruit and expensive cheeses. She wore a cashmere cardigan and her signature pearls. She set the tray on the coffee table right next to Julian's tablet. She looked at my face, then looked at the laptop in my hands. She knew. She had known the whole time. She walked over to Julian and smoothed the collar of his shirt, brushing an invisible speck of dust from his shoulder. She turned to me and lowered her voice to that soft, patronizing register she always used when she wanted to sweep a problem under the rug. She told me not to make this harder than it had to be. She said Julian needed the seed capital to get his vision off the ground and that family supports family. She told me I was smart and I would figure out another way to pay for my classes, maybe student loans, maybe working a few more shifts at the garage. I stood there and listened to the woman who raised me tell me my education was a sacrificial lamb for my brother's delusion. I did not raise my voice. Shouting is what people do when they want to be heard. I already knew they were never going to listen. I looked at Julian. I asked him to show me the burn rate projections on his tablet. He smirked, eager to play the successful founder. He tapped the screen and brought up a spreadsheet. I read the columns in seconds. $6,000 a month for a leased office space in the Seaport District. $12,000 a month for a marketing agency. An $80,000 base salary for himself. $0 allocated for software development, $0 for engineering. I did the math in my head. With the tax penalties my father absorbed, they had about $120,000 left of my money. At Julian's current burn rate, Vanguard would be entirely bankrupt in less than 10 months. It was not an investment. It was a slow-motion financial suicide. I looked back at my father. I asked him if he had even read the financial breakdowns before he drained my account. Harrison stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket, smoothing the fabric over his chest. He walked toward me until he was standing just 2 feet away, looking down at me. He told me Julian had real potential. He said Julian understood how to network, how to pitch, how to walk into a room and command capital. Then he looked at my hands. I had dirt under my fingernails from replacing a timing belt on a Honda the day before. The skin on my knuckles was dry and cracked from the winter air. Harrison sneered. He told me college was wasted on me anyway. He said I spent all my free time under the hood of dirty cars and writing lines of code in the dark like a mechanic. He told me if I liked working with my hands so much, I should stop pretending to be an academic. He told me to go learn a trade. The room went dead silent. The ice shifted in his glass on the table. Julian went back to swiping on his tablet, a satisfied little smile playing on his lips. Sylvia picked up a piece of cheese and pretended to inspect it, refusing to meet my eyes. They expected me to cry. They expected me to beg for a portion of the money back or threaten to call a lawyer. They wanted a reaction because a reaction would mean they still had power over me. I closed my laptop. I tucked it under my arm. I did not say a single word. I turned around and walked out of the living room. I climbed the wooden stairs to my bedroom. The air up there was colder. I pulled 2 heavy canvas duffel bags from the top shelf of my closet. I did not pack dresses or skirts or the nice blouses my mother bought me for family dinners. I packed thick denim work pants. I packed thermal shirts, heavy wool socks, and my grandfather's vintage socket set. I packed my steel-toe boots. I packed every notebook filled with my applied mathematics formulas. I zipped the bags shut. The sound of the metal zippers seemed incredibly loud in the quiet house. I slung the heavy straps over my shoulders. I walked back downstairs. My father was sitting in his chair again, sipping his scotch. Julian was laughing at something on his phone. Sylvia called out from the kitchen asking if I wanted to stay for dinner. I walked straight to the front door. I turned the brass deadbolt and pulled the heavy wood open. The January wind hit my face like a sheet of ice. The temperature outside was hovering in the single digits. Snow was piled high against the porch railings. I stepped out onto the frozen wood and pulled the door shut behind me. The latch clicked into place, locking me out of my childhood and pushing me into the cold. I stood on the icy sidewalk, watching my breath turn to white clouds in the dark air. My bank account was empty. My family had just funded their own ruin using my future. I adjusted the heavy straps on my shoulders and started walking down the street, hearing the snow crunch under my boots. Where does a 22-year-old girl go in the dead of a New Hampshire winter? With nothing but the clothes on her back, I rode a late-night bus 30 miles south to Manchester. The city was industrial, gritty, and unapologetic. I found a listing tacked to a corkboard in a diner window offering a room for $600 a month. The landlord was an older man who ran an auto body repair shop. The room was directly above his service bays. It had slanted floorboards, a single drafty window, and a radiator that only hissed straight cold water. I handed him the cash from my savings. He gave me a brass key and did not ask why a girl with 2 duffel bags was renting an unheated attic in the middle of a winter freeze. During the day, the floor vibrated from the hydraulic lifts and pneumatic drills operating below. At night, the temperature plummeted so low I could see my own breath hovering in the dark air. I slept under 3 cheap fleece blankets, wearing my heavy denim work clothes. I did not cry. Pity is a useless emotion. Pity does not generate heat, and it does not pay rent. My father told me to learn a trade. I decided to take his advice. The next morning, I walked into the hiring office of a commercial electrical contractor. The foreman was a broad-shouldered man holding a clipboard. He looked at my small frame, my clean boots, and my young face. He laughed and told me this was heavy commercial infrastructure, not a residential arts and crafts project. He said the copper spools weighed more than I did. I did not argue. I pointed to a 50-pound coil of thick-gauge industrial wire sitting in the corner of the room. I walked over, lifted it with proper mechanical leverage, and carried it to his desk without breaking a sweat or shifting my breathing. I asked him what time my shift started. He stopped laughing and handed me a set of intake forms. The reality of commercial electrical work is brutal. It strips away every pretense of comfort. My shift started at 5 o'clock in the morning. We were building out a massive shipping facility on the edge of the city. The structure had no walls yet, just a steel skeleton exposed to the bitter wind. My job was pulling 4/0 copper cable through frozen polyvinyl chloride conduits. The friction was immense. The cold bit through my gloves, freezing my joints. Within the first week, the soft skin on my palms tore open. The blisters popped, bled, and stung with every movement. I cleaned them with rubbing alcohol in the garage sink every night and wrapped them in white athletic tape. I never complained. I never asked for a lighter rotation. Within 2 months, those raw wounds healed into thick, rigid calluses. My hands stopped looking like the hands of a Dartmouth mathematics student. They looked like tools. That was exactly what I wanted. When the physical shift ended at 6 o'clock in the evening, the mental shift began. I would walk back to my freezing room above the garage, heat a cup of water on a hot plate, and eat a bowl of 50-cent instant ramen. Then I opened my laptop, while the other apprentices drank cheap beer at the local dive bar, complaining about the foreman I studied. My father thought a trade was just manual labor. He thought it was blue-collar grunt work beneath his corporate dignity. He did not realize that modern commercial infrastructure is driven by complex data. I applied my university-level mathematics background to electrical theory. I did not just memorize the National Electrical Codebook, I decoded it. I studied 3-phase power distribution programmable logic controllers and smart grid load balancing algorithms. Electrical engineering is just applied math moving through copper highways. I understood the variables, the voltage drops, the resistance formulas, faster than anyone in my cohort. The state licensing board requires a set number of logged hours to take the journeyman exam, but they also offer accelerated testing paths for candidates who demonstrate elite technical proficiency and flawless written exam scores. I petitioned the board, submitted my theoretical load calculations, and took the tests. I passed every single one with perfect marks. I was quietly, legally, and systematically bypassing years of standard progression. 7 months into my exile, the two worlds collided. It was a Tuesday evening in late autumn. I was standing in aisle 4 of a local hardware store. I was covered in gray drywall dust and yellow wire-pulling lubricant. My boots were scuffed gray. I held a basket containing 3 rolls of professional-grade electrical tape and 5 packets of instant noodles. I was mentally calculating the exact sales tax to ensure I had enough loose change in my pocket. Then I smelled her. A wave of expensive floral perfume cut through the scent of fertilizer and raw lumber. I turned my head. My mother, Sylvia, was standing 10 feet away holding a decorative ceramic planter. She wore a tailored wool coat and pristine leather boots. She froze. Her eyes scanned my face, my dirty clothes, my taped fingers, and finally the cheap food in my plastic basket. I watched the emotions cycle across her face. First shock, then mild embarrassment, and finally a deep, settling pity. She walked toward me, speaking in that same hushed, patronizing tone she used the night I was thrown out. She asked how I was surviving. She looked at the grease on my jawline and sighed. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a crisp $20 bill, holding it out toward me like I was a stranger begging on a street corner. I looked at the green paper. I looked at her manicured nails. I did not feel anger. I felt nothing at all. I told her I could pay for my own groceries. I turned around, walked to the cashier, counted out my coins exactly, and left the store. I did not look back to see if she was watching. Sylvia drove her luxury sedan back to Concord. She walked into the warm, well-lit house where Harrison was reading the financial news and Julian was playing a video game on his phone. I know exactly what she told them because I knew how her mind worked. She told them she saw me. She told them I looked terrible. She reported that I was covered in dirt buying the cheapest food available and barely scraping by. That encounter was the perfect diversion. It fed their arrogance. Harrison felt vindicated. He smiled, believing his tough love had put me in my rightful place at the bottom of the economic ladder. Julian laughed, shaking his head at the sister who wired outlets while he played the visionary tech founder. They swallowed the narrative whole. They went to sleep in their warm beds feeling superior, complacent, and entirely secure in their choices. They were completely unaware that the grease-stained girl in the hardware store was a ghost. Julian was sitting in a leased office in Boston, bleeding out the last drops of my stolen college fund to pay for an illusion. He was building a house of cards that was already beginning to sway in the wind. Meanwhile, I was in a freezing room running complex electrical load simulations, mapping out automated power grids, and holding a newly minted commercial journeyman license. I had stripped away everything weak about myself. I was laying a foundation of solid concrete deep underground where none of them could see it. They thought I was a failure because my hands were dirty. How does a grease-stained apprentice scale up to the elite levels of commercial contracting? I turned 23 as the winter thawed into a damp New Hampshire spring. My calluses were permanent now. I had my journeyman license framed in a cheap plastic border sitting on the desk in my small apartment. I was no longer an apprentice running heavy wire for foremen who underestimated me. I was looking at the regional economy, tracing the flow of capital the way I used to trace voltage drops on a chalkboard. I looked 90 miles north to Lake Winnipesaukee. The lake's region was changing. It was no longer just a quiet retreat for old money families in dusty timber cabins. Wealthy tech executives from Boston and New York were moving in, buying up pristine shoreline and building sprawling architectural marvels. They wanted glass walls and heated driveways. More importantly, they demanded full smart home automation. They wanted their security systems, climate control solar arrays, and private server rooms all integrated into a single seamless network controlled from their smartphones. That demand created a massive blind spot in the construction industry. I saw the friction clearly. Software engineers understand code, but they do not understand thermodynamics. If you let an IT guy touch a 400-amp service panel, he will likely burn the structure to the ground. On the other side, the old-school electricians can bend rigid metal conduit all day long and wire standard circuits in their sleep. But if you ask them to program an application, programming interface, or balance a digital load algorithm, they look at the screen like it is written in a dead language. The market was begging for an entity that spoke both languages. I spoke both. I understood the copper, and I understood the code. I went to the state registry and filed the paperwork to form a corporate shell. I named it Apex Holdings, LLC. I knew the reality of commercial contracting. Egos run the job sites. A 23-year-old woman walking into a bidding room wearing work boots and a Carhartt jacket would never be handed a multi-million-dollar infrastructure project. The general contractors would talk down to her. The investors would second-guess her numbers. I did not have the time or the patience to fight institutional bias. I needed a shield. I needed a frontman. I found a man named Bennett. He was 55 years old with silver hair at his temples and a wardrobe full of tailored charcoal suits. He was a former logistics executive who had been pushed out of his firm during a hostile corporate merger. He was sharp hungry and tired of playing traditional corporate games. We met at a quiet diner outside Manchester. I slid my business plan across the sticky laminate table. I told him he would be the president, the public face, the handshaker. He would attend the golf outings and the board meetings. I would be the shadow CEO, operating behind the curtain, handling every calculation, every blueprint, and every hiring decision. Bennett looked at my age, then looked down at the math on the paper. The numbers were undeniable. He finished his coffee, shook my hand, and Apex Grid Solutions was born. Our first target was a sprawling estate renovation on the western shore of the lake. A tech developer was pouring $2 million into a heavy smart grid upgrade. The primary contractors were soliciting bids for the electrical phase. I managed to secure a copy of the architectural blueprints. I spread the thick paper rolls across the cheap folding table in my apartment, weighing down the corners with heavy textbooks. I traced the engineered lines with a red pen under the glow of a single desk lamp. It took me 4 hours to find the fatal flaw. The high-priced architects had routed the smart home server cooling system through an unisolated neutral ground bonding loop in the secondary subpanel. It was a subtle oversight, but a lethal one. If the summer heat spiked and the servers drew excess amperage, the cooling system would trigger a thermal runaway. The excess current would melt the insulation right off the copper wire. It was a guaranteed electrical fire waiting to ignite within the first year of occupancy. I drafted a revised schematic. I sent Bennett into the bidding meeting the next morning. He walked into the polished conference room, wearing a pristine suit, carrying a leather briefcase. He sat across from the lead architects and the wealthy client. Bennett opened the briefcase and laid out my red-lined schematics. Using the exact phrasing I had fed him, Bennett pointed to the grounding loop error. He calmly explained the thermal runaway risk, outlining the precise temperature at which the house would catch fire. The lead architect turned pale, checking his own math and realizing Bennett was right. The client looked at the architects with sheer disgust, realizing his expensive design team had almost built him a multi-million-dollar bonfire. Bennett smoothly slid the Apex Grid Solutions proposal across the table. He promised flawless execution and ironclad safety. The client signed the contract before the meeting was over. We executed the job flawlessly. I hired a specialized crew of seasoned tradesmen. I worked alongside them wearing a hard hat and an unmarked safety vest, blending in as just another worker on the site. We finished the integration 2 weeks ahead of schedule. The software communicated perfectly with the high-voltage mains. The final payment cleared the bank on a Tuesday morning. I sat in my apartment and opened the corporate account ledger. The net profit from that single residential contract sat glowing on the screen, $150,000. It was the exact numerical value my father had drained from my college fund. It took my grandfather 2 decades of hard labor to save that money. It took Julian mere months to burn it on empty marketing and leased office space. It took me one single, well-executed contract to build it back from the dirt. I did not throw a party. I did not buy a luxury vehicle or rent a flashy corner office to stroke my own ego. I quietly rolled the entire sum back into the company to secure commercial bonding and hire more elite crews. I needed a vehicle for the job sites, so I bought a used reliable white Ford F-150 pickup truck. I needed to track my crew shifts, so I bought a plain silver Casio watch. I kept my overhead low and my footprint invisible. The industry started whispering about Apex Grid Solutions. Competitors talked about the brilliant executive Bennett, who had seemingly materialized out of nowhere to dominate the regional smart infrastructure market. Nobody looked twice at the quiet girl in dirty denim, driving the white pickup truck, picking up electrical supplies at the local distributor. I liked it that way. My anonymity was my greatest asset. The ghost, the hardware store girl my family pitied, was now quietly building an empire. The contracts began to multiply. We transitioned from residential estates to heavy commercial tech campuses in Massachusetts and southern New Hampshire. But scaling an infrastructure empire requires raw materials. You cannot build automated grids without mountains of industrial copper wiring. As our footprint expanded, a global supply chain shortage hit the market. Cargo ships were stalled. Manufacturing slowed. The shortage crippled construction firms across New England, causing widespread project defaults. There was only one regional distributor holding enough bulk inventory to keep Apex Grid alive and prevent us from defaulting on our penalty clauses. That distributor was a commercial logistics firm based in Concord, a firm owned and operated by Harrison Wright. How does a shadow CEO secure the heavy metal she needs to survive from a father who would rather see her starve without exposing the empire she has built? Apex Grid secured 3 new commercial contracts by the end of our first year. The scale of the work shifted from wealthy lakefront properties to heavy corporate infrastructure. We won a bid for a server farm in Burlington, a robotics research laboratory in Waltham, and an automated distribution hub just over the Massachusetts border. These were not simple wiring jobs. They required intricate load-balancing redundant power grids and miles of heavy-gauge conductive metal. The profit margins were steep, but the legal stakes were unforgiving. Commercial development runs on a brutal calendar. Every contract I drafted contained a liquidated damages clause. If my crews missed the installation deadline, Apex Grid would be penalized $10,000 a day per site. Missing the target by just 2 weeks would wipe out every dollar of capital I had meticulously accumulated. I accepted that risk because I trusted my math and I trusted my tradesmen. I did not account for the global supply lines snapping shut. The crisis started overseas. Cargo ships sat idle in distant ports. Manufacturing plants slowed their output. Suddenly, the industrial market experienced a critical famine of raw materials. The lifeblood of my company is insulated stranded copper wire. Without it, we were just a collection of empty conduits and useless software algorithms. My project managers started sending me urgent updates. The local supply houses were empty. The national distributors were placing orders on back order for 6 months. I needed tons of copper to wire the 3 campuses, and I had less than 90 days before the penalty clauses triggered and bankrupted my young firm. I sat in my apartment analyzing the regional freight logs. I tracked the flow of heavy industrial materials across New England. The data painted a very clear and very grim picture. There was only one supply broker holding enough bulk inventory in their regional warehouses to fulfill the Apex Grid requirements. That entity was Wright Freight and Supply, the commercial logistics firm owned and operated by my father Harrison. Harrison built his business by playing the middleman. He specialized in purchasing distressed industrial inventory, storing it in his sprawling Concord warehouses, and selling it at a premium when the market tightened. He had hoarded miles of thick-gauge copper cabling before the shortage hit. Now he held a functional monopoly over the regional supply. I could not simply call his office and place an order. If Harrison saw the name Apex Grid on a purchase order, he would investigate the buyer. If he traced the corporate registration back to me, he would wield his monopoly like a weapon. He would refuse the sale out of pure spite or artificially inflate the price to suffocate my margins. I had to acquire his inventory without him ever knowing I was the one taking it. I closed my eyes and pictured his home office. Growing up, I spent years watching him work. I remembered his ledgers, his shipping manifests, and his rigid adherence to specific tax cycles. Harrison was predictable. He utilized a network of secondary holding yards across the state to store his overflow materials. He always waited until the final Friday of the month to consolidate those secondary stockpiles into his primary warehouse. He did this to bundle his freight taxes and flip the consolidated tonnage to national buyers at a staggering markup. His predictability was his vulnerability. I opened my laptop and wrote a predictive algorithm. I pulled Public Department of Transportation weigh station data, commercial freight logs, and regional transit schedules. I cross-referenced those figures with the precise locations of his secondary holding yards. I mapped the exact route his transport trucks would take to retrieve the copper. I calculated the exact day and hour the wire would be sitting vulnerable on those remote loading docks before his primary brokers locked the inventory into a consolidated contract. I called Bennett into our Portsmouth headquarters. I handed him a list of 4 independent holding yards and a precise schedule. I authorized him to drain our operational capital reserves to make the purchases. I instructed him to approach the managers of those secondary yards, directly acting as a motivated independent buyer. Bennett understood the assignment perfectly. He wore his tailored suits and carried a briefcase full of certified bank drafts. He arrived at the first holding yard in Nashua just 48 hours before Harrison's trucks were scheduled to pick up the freight. The yard manager was holding 20 spools of high-capacity copper, waiting for the end-of-month transfer. Bennett walked into the dispatch office and offered a swift cash transaction at an 8% premium over the current market rate. In the logistics industry, cash in hand always beats a pending corporate transfer. The yard manager looked at the bank draft, realized he could pocket a higher margin without paying the transport fees, and signed the release forms. Bennett backed a rented flatbed truck up to the loading dock and stripped the yard of its valuable conductive metal. He repeated this exact tactical strike across 3 other holding yards. He moved through Salem Dairy and Hooksett. By the time the sun set on Thursday evening, Bennett had secured enough raw material to wire all 3 of our active job sites. He effectively dismantled my father's supply chain right out from under him, acting as an invisible force scooping up the assets just hours before the consolidation window closed. On Friday morning, Harrison's transport trucks arrived at the secondary yards to collect his inventory. They found empty pallets and signed release receipts. I was not in his Concord office to witness his reaction, but the industry rumors traveled fast. Harrison was furious. He had pre-negotiated a lucrative sale with a national infrastructure firm based on the total consolidated tonnage. Because Apex Grid poached his stockpiles, he failed to meet the weight requirements for his national buyer. The buyer canceled the contract and went elsewhere. Harrison lost a multi-million-dollar flip. He spent weeks yelling at his dispatchers and screaming at the yard managers, trying to uncover the identity of the rogue contractor who bought out his supply. The trail led nowhere. Bennett used generic corporate LLCs for the purchases, and the rental trucks were untraceable. Harrison cursed his invisible competitor, pounding his fists on his desk, frustrated by an adversary he could not see and could not outsmart. Meanwhile, Apex Grid deployed the copper. My crews worked double shifts, threading the heavy wire through the ceiling grids of the server farm, the research lab, and the transit hub. We met every single installation deadline. We bypassed the liquidated damages clauses and secured the final payouts. The profit margin stabilized. My corporate accounts filled with legitimate untethered capital. I had legally, cleanly, and ruthlessly outmaneuvered my father in his own domain, securing my empire while leaving him to count his losses. I sat in my F-150 pickup truck outside the completed Waltham robotics lab, watching my crew pack their tools. I looked at the calluses on my hands. I had survived the global shortage. I had beaten the commercial market. I had turned my father's greed against him. I was quietly accumulating hard assets, building a fortress of concrete software and copper. But while I was securing physical infrastructure, my brother Julian was bleeding out. The seed capital he had stolen from my college fund was evaporating into the Boston air. He was playing the role of a visionary founder, hosting expensive dinners and ordering bespoke business cards while his bank accounts ran dry. He had no product and no incoming revenue. He was racing toward a financial cliff, and he was preparing to drag our family over the edge with him. I tracked the collapse from afar, waiting for the inevitable impact. Julian burned through my $150,000, but the real disaster was the toxic debt he was about to unleash. The architecture of a financial collapse is rarely loud. It does not happen with a sudden dramatic crash. It happens quietly, line by line, in the margins of a spreadsheet until the foundation can no longer support the weight of the illusion. While Apex Grid was solidifying its grip on the New England infrastructure market, Julian was busy constructing a masterpiece of sheer incompetence down in Boston. Vanguard was dead before it ever launched. The app that promised to integrate lifestyle synergy was nothing more than a hollow digital facade. Julian spent 18 months leasing a corner office in the Seaport district with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor. He bought ergonomic Herman Miller chairs for employees he never hired. He paid a boutique design agency $40,000 to redesign the logo 3 separate times. He expensed steak dinners, networking events, and a leased Tesla Model S. He did everything a successful tech founder does except write code and generate revenue. The $150,000 he took from my college fund evaporated. It was burned as fuel to heat an empty house. When the liquid capital ran dry, Julian panicked. He could not downsize. He could not admit failure. Retreating to a smaller office or moving back to Concord would shatter the narrative he had carefully cultivated for his new social circle and his entitled new wife, Lauren. He needed an infusion of cash just to cover his operational burn rate and maintain the optics of success. No legitimate venture capital firm would touch Vanguard. They looked at his user acquisition metrics, which stood at 0, and politely showed him the door. Julian had only one option left. He turned to the only investor gullible enough to buy into his delusion. He drove up to Concord and sat down in my father's home office. I did not need to be in the room to know how the conversation went. Julian likely used the same corporate buzzwords he practiced in front of his bathroom mirror. He told Harrison they were on the precipice of a major breakthrough. He claimed they were in the final stages of beta testing and just needed runway capital to reach the initial public offering. He spun a narrative of imminent wealth and exponential returns. Harrison wanted to believe it. He needed to believe it because admitting Julian was a fraud meant admitting he had stolen my future for absolutely nothing. Harrison agreed to act as the financial guarantor for a massive capital injection. They approached a secondary commercial lender, high-interest predatory terms, and zero forgiveness. The bank approved a $500,000 line of credit. But lenders did not hand out $500,000 based on the promises of a smooth-talking tech founder. They require hard collateral. They need an asset they can seize and liquidate when the borrower inevitably defaults. Harrison leveraged his life's work. He pledged the deed to his primary commercial logistics warehouse in Concord. The massive facility was the beating heart of his entire supply chain empire. It held his dispatch offices, his loading docks, and his heavy equipment. He signed the collateral agreement, tying the survival of his 30-year-old logistics company directly to the success of a non-existent lifestyle app. Sylvia cheered the decision. She saw the loan documents not as a death warrant, but as proof of Julian's rising status. She spent her afternoons at the local country club sitting on the patio, drinking white wine with her friends. She boasted that her son was navigating the pre-IPO landscape, securing mezzanine funding from private equity channels. She used those terms without having any idea what they actually meant. She wrapped herself in the comforting blanket of his perceived success, completely blind to the fact that her husband had just mortgaged their financial stability to fund a sinking ship. I watched the entire disaster unfold from my apartment in Manchester. The public record is a beautiful and unforgiving thing. Commercial loans and property liens are filed with the county clerk. Corporate registrations and tax defaults are logged with the state. I did not need to hire a private investigator or hack into their emails. I simply knew where to look and how to read the data. I sat at my small desk, eating a bowl of plain rice, illuminated by the blue glow of my laptop screen. I opened a new file and created an encrypted spreadsheet. I named it the Vanguard Ledger. I typed in the initial stolen principal $150,000. I pulled the public filings for the Seaport office lease and calculated the monthly burn rate. I sourced the loan documents from the Merrimack County Registry of Deeds. I added the new $500,000 line of credit to the ledger. I calculated the compound interest based on the predatory rates typical for secondary commercial lenders. I tracked the monthly amortization schedule, mapping out exactly how fast the debt would balloon. The math was brutal. Julian was drawing down the loan to pay his personal salary and keep the Boston office open. He was generating zero income to service the debt. Harrison was using the profits from his logistics business to cover the monthly interest payments, bleeding his own company dry just to keep the bank from seizing the warehouse. Every time Harrison missed a payment deadline, the bank applied a penalty fee. I logged every single one. Every time Julian filed a delayed corporate tax return, the state applied a surcharge. I logged those too. I watched the numbers in the Vanguard ledger grow, turning from black to a deep, violent red. My family was legally tethered to Julian's gross incompetence. They were sinking into a swamp of toxic debt, and they were doing it with smiles on their faces, believing they were on the verge of incredible wealth. I updated the spreadsheet every Friday night, tracking their descent with cold, clinical precision. I felt no pity. I felt no urge to warn them. The ledger was a mirror, reflecting the true cost of their arrogance. My own accounts told a very different story. Apex Grid was thriving. Our revenue was stable. Our crews were expanding. And my quiet anonymity remained fully intact. I spent my days analyzing blueprints, inspecting high-voltage panels, and managing infrastructure schedules. I kept my head down and let my work speak for itself. But staying invisible is a fragile balancing act. New Hampshire is a small state, and the commercial networks often overlap. I had successfully avoided my family for nearly 3 years, maintaining strict operational discipline. I believed I was a ghost watching them from a safe distance. The debt bomb I was tracking in my spreadsheet was ticking down steadily, heading toward an unavoidable detonation. I knew exactly when the numbers would break them. I just had to wait. Waiting requires patience and control. It requires walking past the people who wronged you without letting them see the power you hold. I thought my discipline was unbreakable. Then I walked into a coffee shop before dawn, expecting a quiet morning, and found myself standing face to face with the architect of my family's ruin. The numbers on my screen were safe and predictable, but confronting Julian and his entitled new wife in the real world was about to test every ounce of restraint I possessed. My operations required me to drive up to Concord early on a Tuesday morning. Apex Grid had secured a massive logistics center build-out on the northern edge of the city. I needed to conduct a site inspection before my foreman arrived to begin laying the primary conduit pathways. It was barely 6 a.m. The sky was still a bruised purple, and the temperature hovered near freezing. I parked my white F-150 pickup truck behind a small independent coffee shop on Main Street. I walked inside. The heat from the espresso machines hit my face. I was dressed for the job site. Heavy steel-toe boots, thick canvas Carhartt pants, and a dark gray work jacket stained with white PVC glue around the cuffs. My hair was pulled back into a tight knot. I carried no purse, just a brass money clip in my front pocket. I stood at the counter and ordered a large black coffee. The bell above the glass door chimed. 2 people walked into the quiet shop, letting a blast of winter wind inside. I did not need to turn around to recognize the voices. Julian was complaining about the cold. He was wearing a tailored wool overcoat and expensive leather loafers, completely impractical for the New Hampshire weather. Clinging to his arm was his new wife, Lauren. They had married 6 months prior in a lavish ceremony in Boston, funded entirely by the commercial loan my father had guaranteed. Lauren was the kind of woman who wore oversized designer sunglasses indoors. She was draped in a pristine white puffer jacket and carried a handbag that cost more than my first truck. They stood in line directly behind me. I kept my eyes focused on the barista operating the espresso machine. I did not tense my shoulders. I did not try to hide my face. I simply waited for my coffee. Julian noticed my boots first. The heavy, scuffed leather stood out against the polished tile floor. His eyes traveled up the stiff canvas pants and the stained work jacket. He recognized the profile. I heard him let out a short, sharp breath of amusement. Lauren leaned into him, her voice carrying easily across the small, empty shop. She asked him who the construction worker was. Julian chuckled, a dry, arrogant sound. He told her it was his little sister, Madison. Lauren dramatically pulled back. She raised a gloved hand and actually covered her nose as if the faint smell of industrial grease and cold copper wire was physically offensive to her delicate sensibilities. She looked me up and down, taking in my unpolished appearance with sheer disgust. She pitched her voice louder, intentionally projecting it so the barista and the 2 other customers in the shop could hear her. She asked Julian if I was the sister who wired outlets for a living. She said it the way someone might ask about a stray dog digging through the garbage. Julian smiled a wide, self-satisfied grin. He nodded and patted Lauren's arm, playing the role of the benevolent, wealthy sibling looking down on the unfortunate peasant. He said, "Our father told her to go learn a trade," and it looked like I took the advice literally. He shook his head, feigning pity, and muttered something about how hard it must be to scrape by doing manual labor. I did not turn around. I did not engage in the petty banter. Engaging would mean stepping into their reality, validating their fragile egos with my anger. I had outgrown their reality years ago. I simply reached into my pocket, pulled out a crisp $20 bill, and set it on the counter to pay for my drink. While the barista counted my change, I turned my head slightly and looked out the front window of the coffee shop. Julian's leased Tesla Model S was idling at the curb. The sleek white car looked pristine from a distance, an electric monument to his supposed tech wealth. But my eyes were trained to catch details most people ignore. I looked past the polished paint and focused on the rear license plate. The small colored registration sticker in the top right corner caught the morning light. It was red. The current year required a blue sticker. I did the mental math instantly. The registration was expired, not by a few days or a few weeks. It was dead by over 6 months. That small red square of plastic was the most important piece of information in the entire room. You do not let a luxury vehicle registration lapse for half a year out of sheer forgetfulness. You let it lapse because the leasing company has suspended your account. You let it lapse because the bank has frozen your assets. You let it lapse because you are hiding from the very people who own the car you are driving. I knew exactly what that red sticker meant. The commercial lenders had stopped waiting for Julian's empty promises. The grace periods were over. The repossession agents were already holding the tracking paperwork, hunting for that exact vehicle. Julian was standing in a coffee shop laughing at my boots, completely unaware that he was driving a stolen car with a target painted on its bumper. The barista handed me my coffee and my change. I took the paper cup. I turned around and faced Julian and Lauren. Julian's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. He expected me to look angry or humiliated. He expected me to shrink under Lauren's judgmental stare. Instead, I looked at them with the cold, detached curiosity of an auditor examining a bankrupt ledger. Lauren scoffed, crossing her arms over her pristine white jacket, waiting for me to apologize for being in her presence. I did not say a word to Julian. I looked directly into Lauren's eyes and offered her a calm, terrifyingly blank smile. It was the kind of smile that offers absolutely no comfort. It was the smile of someone who knows exactly how the story ends. I walked past them. The heavy tread of my boots hit the tile floor with a steady, rhythmic thud. I pushed the glass door open and stepped out into the freezing morning air. I did not look back at the Tesla. I walked to my truck, climbed into the cab, and started the engine. I sat there for a moment, letting the heater warm my hands. Julian had his laugh. He had his moment of perceived superiority performing for his entitled wife. But a laugh does not pay down principal, and arrogance does not stop a foreclosure. The Vanguard ledger I kept encrypted on my laptop was no longer a theoretical projection. The numbers were bleeding into the real world. The expired registration sticker was just the first visible crack in the dam. If Julian could no longer afford the basic administrative fees to keep his leased car on the road, it meant the $500,000 commercial loan was already in default. It meant Harrison was no longer able to cover the monthly interest payments using the profits from his logistics company. The massive warehouse in Concord, the beating heart of my father's entire empire, the asset he pledged to secure Julian's delusion, was now sitting exposed on the bank's chopping block. The financial bomb they had built was ticking down its final seconds. I shifted my truck into drive and pulled away from the coffee shop, heading toward my job site. The confrontation tested my discipline, but it also confirmed my timeline. The collapse was imminent. Harrison was about to face the catastrophic consequences of his own arrogance. He was going to lose his life's work unless he could pull off a miracle. He would need to secure a massive capital bailout, and he would need to find a commercial contractor capable of executing an impossible task to save his property. He had no idea he was about to dial the number of the daughter he had thrown away. The reality of predatory lending is that the bank does not care about your social status or your country club memberships. A secondary commercial lender operates on strict mathematical thresholds. When a borrower misses a payment, the grace period is practically non-existent. The red registration sticker on my brother's leased luxury car was just an early warning sign. The true impact arrived via certified mail delivered directly to my father's corporate office in Concord. It was a formal notice of default. Harrison had failed to service the interest on the $500,000 loan he co-signed for Vanguard. The bank initiated the pre-foreclosure process. They placed a legal encumbrance on the deed to his primary logistics center. The ticking clock began the moment the courier handed Harrison that sealed envelope. He had exactly 30 days to cure the defect, pay the outstanding arrears, and satisfy the principal. If he failed, the bank would seize the property, auction it off to the highest bidder, and liquidate his 30-year legacy to balance their ledgers. Panic is a corrosive element. It eats through the strongest facades. The illusion of wealth and success that my mother and father had carefully maintained began to disintegrate. Sylvia stopped attending her afternoon luncheons. She could no longer sit on the patio and boast about her son's pre-IPO status when the local banking executives knew her husband was facing an imminent property seizure. The whispers in their social circle turned from envy to quiet judgment. Harrison tried to reach the architect of the disaster. He called Julian. He called the Boston office number. He called Lauren's cell phone. He received nothing but silence. The golden boy, the son with so much real potential, the visionary who needed my college fund to launch his empire, simply vanished. Julian retreated into his leased apartment and turned off his devices. He refused to face the destruction he caused. He left his father holding the legal and financial bag. It was the ultimate act of cowardice, but it was entirely predictable. You cannot build a resilient character when you are handed every advantage and shielded from every consequence. Harrison was trapped, but he was also a survivor. He understood he could not save Vanguard, and he could no longer afford the carrying costs of the debt. His only viable exit strategy was an immediate cash sale of the encumbered real estate. He needed to liquidate the logistics center, pay off the predatory lender, and hopefully retain a fraction of his remaining equity to start over. He listed the facility on the commercial market at a distressed discount. The low price attracted an immediate buyer. A growing biomedical manufacturing firm based in Cambridge was looking to expand their footprint northward. They needed a sprawling industrial space near the interstate corridor. They toured the Concord property and submitted a cash offer that would clear Harrison's debt and halt the bank seizure. Harrison accepted the offer the same day. He thought he had engineered a miraculous escape. He thought he could outrun the consequences of his bad investment. He forgot that modern commercial real estate transactions require rigorous due diligence. The biomedical firm sent an independent industrial inspector to evaluate the structural integrity of the facility. The inspector spent 2 days walking the floor, scanning the walls with thermal imaging cameras, and testing the infrastructure. The report he delivered to the buyers was devastating. Biomedical manufacturing requires pristine environmental controls. The facility would need to support banks of sub-zero freezers, heavy continuous air filtration, and automated sterile clean rooms. The power draw for that equipment is immense. The inspector noted that the logistics center still ran on its original electrical grid installed 3 decades ago. The main service panels featured corroded bus bars. The neutral grounding was non-compliant with current industrial codes. The secondary conduit feeds were degraded. The inspector concluded that connecting modern biotech server loads to that archaic grid would result in immediate thermal overload. It was a systemic fire hazard. The wiring would literally melt under the required amperage. The buyers delivered their ultimatum. They still wanted the location, but they refused to inherit a fire trap. The sale became strictly contingent on a full, code-compliant smart grid overhaul. Harrison needed to rip out the archaic wiring, upgrade the heavy service mains, and install automated load balancing panels. The contingency came with a lethal time constraint. Because the bank was actively holding the pre-foreclosure notice, the municipal clock was ticking. The biomedical firm demanded the electrical upgrade be completed, inspected, and certified in exactly 45 days. If the work extended to day 46, the bank would take possession. The buyers would pull their cash offer, and Harrison would be left with nothing. 45 days in the commercial construction sector is a microscopic window. Drafting the engineering schematics, pulling the municipal permits, sourcing the raw materials, and executing the manual labor usually requires a minimum of 6 months. Harrison called his standard contractors. He called the men he had played golf with for 20 years. He begged them to take the job. Every single contractor looked at the timeline and declined the bid. The liability was too high. The supply chain was too tight. Nobody wanted to risk their own corporate bonding on a frantic, desperate rush job. Harrison was pacing his office, watching his escape route collapse in front of his eyes. He called his commercial real estate broker, demanding a solution. The broker told him the harsh truth of the current New England market. There was only one infrastructure entity operating in the region capable of executing a turnaround at that velocity. A firm known for elite engineering, flawless material procurement, and a ruthless adherence to deadlines. The broker wrote a name on a piece of paper and slid it across the desk. Apex Grid Solutions. Harrison had heard the name before. He knew Apex was the invisible competitor that had bought out his secondary copper stockpiles months prior. He knew they were expensive, exclusive, and highly selective about their clientele. He did not care. Desperation strips away pride. He went to the corporate website and opened the client intake portal. He typed in his name. He typed the address of his logistics center. He detailed the 45-day deadline, the biomed requirements, and the urgency of the situation. He checked the box agreeing to the expedited review fee and clicked Submit. He prayed the faceless corporate machine would process his request and grant him a lifeline. The digital intake form bypassed the standard queue. The routing algorithm I designed recognized the Concord address and the applicant name immediately. It forwarded the document directly to the secure terminal on my desk in Portsmouth. I was sitting in my office reviewing a set of schematics when the notification chimed. I clicked the icon. The file opened. I looked at the screen. I saw Harrison Wright listed as the primary applicant. I read the structural details of the facility where I used to sweep floors on Saturday mornings. I saw the desperate 45-day timeline. I knew exactly what that narrow window meant. I could see the shadow of the bank hovering over his rushed keystrokes. He was cornered. My father had thrown me out into the winter cold because he thought my hands were only good for dirty work. He told me I lacked potential. Now he was sitting in his failing headquarters, begging a stranger to use their dirty hands to save his legacy. I leaned back in my chair. The office was quiet, except for the low hum of the servers in the adjacent room. I rested my calloused fingers on the edge of the mahogany desk. I held the power to ignore the request, letting the bank sweep in and erase his empire. I could delete the file and watch him drown in the debt Julian created. Or I could accept the contract step into his falling house and lay the architecture for a much more precise accounting. Will I save the father who ruined my future, or will I engineer a flawless binding commercial trap? I hit the intercom button on my desk and asked Bennett to step into my office. He walked in carrying his signature leather folder, wearing a charcoal suit that looked sharp against the industrial concrete walls of the Portsmouth headquarters. I turned my monitor toward him and pointed to the digital intake form resting on the screen. Bennett read the name. He read the address of the Concord Logistics Center. He looked up at me, his expression entirely neutral. He knew the history. He knew exactly who Harrison Wright was and what that man had done to secure the initial capital for his failing son. Bennett was a seasoned executive who had survived hostile corporate takeovers. He did not ask me about my feelings. He simply asked me how we were going to structure the response. I told him we were going to take the job. I instructed him to draft the engineering schematics based on the biomedical requirements and to prepare a formal commercial bid. I set the total cost of the project at exactly $300,000. Bennett raised an eyebrow. That figure represented a severe premium. It was roughly 40% higher than the standard market rate for an electrical overhaul of that square footage. I explained the math to him. The premium was not an arbitrary punishment. It was the exact numerical value required to mobilize 3 elite crews, secure expedited municipal permits, and deploy our remaining copper stockpiles to hit an impossible 45-day deadline. If Harrison wanted a miracle, he was going to pay the miracle surcharge. But the total cost was secondary to the specific legal mechanics I wanted embedded in the contract. I pulled out a legal pad and wrote down 2 distinct operational clauses. I handed the paper to Bennett. The first clause required a mandatory non-refundable deposit of $150,000 transferred via wire to the Apex Grid corporate accounts before a single piece of equipment was moved onto the property. 50% upfront is steep, but not entirely unheard of in emergency commercial contracting. The second clause was the anchor. I instructed Bennett to insert an accelerated default provision. It stipulated that the final payment of $150,000 was due exactly 48 hours after the municipal inspector signed the certificate of occupancy. If the client missed that payment deadline by a single minute, the contract automatically granted Apex Grid Solutions the right to absorb the primary encumbrance on the property. In plain terms, if Harrison failed to pay the final invoice, my company would legally assume the bank's position, allowing me to seize his warehouse directly. Bennett read the handwritten clauses. He understood the architecture of the trap immediately. It was flawless, aggressive, and entirely legal. It bound the client to a rigid financial timeline while offering no room for negotiation or excuses. Bennett nodded, placed the paper in his folder, and walked out of my office to draft the binding documents. I knew my father. I knew how he operated in the business world. He was a bully who relied on his volume and his deep pockets to intimidate local contractors. He habitually paid his invoices 30 or 60 days late, forcing smaller businesses to absorb the carrying costs while he banked the interest. He viewed service agreements as fluid suggestions rather than concrete obligations. I was banking on that exact arrogance to secure the trap. Bennett transmitted the formal bid to the Concord office later that afternoon. Harrison received the document and immediately called our Portsmouth headquarters. He bypassed the receptionist and demanded to speak to the executive in charge. Bennett took the call in his office while I listened silently on a secure parallel extension. My father's voice crackled through the speakerphone. He was furious. He yelled about the $300,000 price tag, calling it extortionate and predatory. He demanded a 20% discount, citing his long-standing presence in the local business community. He tried to leverage his non-existent reputation against a corporate entity that cared only about numbers. Bennett responded with the calm, measured tone of a man holding all the leverage. He informed Harrison that the price reflected the unprecedented 45-day deadline. He explained that pulling crews off other lucrative sites to accommodate a distressed client required premium compensation. He bluntly stated that Apex Grid did not negotiate its rates and the offer would expire at the close of business. Harrison pivoted his attack. He targeted the accelerated default provision. He complained that 48 hours to process a final invoice was an absurd and hostile timeline. He demanded standard net 30 terms, allowing him a month to gather the funds after the completion of the work. He claimed the lien assumption clause was an insult to his integrity. Bennett did not flinch. He told Harrison the terms were non-negotiable. He gently reminded my father that the biomed firm was prepared to walk away from the purchase entirely if the facility burned down during a thermal overload. He pointed out that if the buyers walked, the bank would execute the foreclosure and the logistics center would be auctioned for pennies. Bennett painted the bleak reality using cold, undeniable facts. I sat in my office listening to my father breathe heavily into the phone receiver. He was out of options. His normal tactics of intimidation and delayed payments were useless against a wall of corporate policy. He was cornered by the very debt his golden boy Julian had created. Harrison muttered a string of curses into the phone. He told Bennett he would sign the paperwork, but promised to remember how Apex Grid treated local business owners. He hung up the phone with a sharp click. 30 minutes later, the digital contract returned through the secure portal. Harrison had applied his electronic signature to the bottom of the document. He legally bound himself to the premium price, the massive upfront deposit, and the lethal default provision. He signed it because he was desperate, but more importantly, he signed it because he still believed he was the smartest man in the room. He thought he could secure the vital electrical upgrades, satisfy the biomedical buyers, close the real estate sale, and then simply tie up the final invoice in a protracted legal dispute. He assumed he could bully the faceless executives at Apex Grid the same way he bullied every other vendor in his network. He thought a signature on a digital screen was just a formality he could manipulate later. He was completely unaware that he had just handed a loaded weapon directly to the daughter he discarded. He thought he was outsmarting a corporate entity. He did not know he was walking into a mathematical execution designed by a commercial journeyman who knew his exact vulnerabilities. The initial wire transfer of $150,000 hit the Apex Grid accounts the next morning. It was exactly half of the total bid. It was also the exact amount he had drained from my college fund 3 years prior. The irony was not lost on me as I watched the digital numbers confirm the deposit. The stolen seed capital he used to launch Julian's delusion had returned to me through a binding commercial contract. With the funds secured, I authorized the deployment. I dispatched 3 of my best crews to the Concord facility. I sent flatbed trucks loaded with heavy-gauge copper conduit pipes and automated smart panels. I instructed my foreman to run double shifts working around the clock to meet the brutal deadline. The trap was set. The contract was signed. The physical work began. Harrison was about to watch his failing warehouse transform into a modern marvel of electrical engineering. He was going to use my labor to try and save his empire. He was going to stand on his loading docks and watch my crews perform the gritty manual work he had always despised. But the completion of the grid was only the first phase of the operation. The real test would come when the final invoice dropped and Harrison realized his accounts were completely empty. What will happen when a man accustomed to taking whatever he wants is forced to pay a debt he can no longer afford? The heavy machinery arrived at the Concord Logistics Center before dawn on a Monday morning. 5 flatbed trucks bearing the discreet Apex Grid emblem pulled into the loading bays. My foreman stepped out carrying digital tablets and laser measuring tools. They did not look like the dusty, overworked laborers my father was accustomed to bullying. They wore clean, uniformed jackets and moved with the synchronized efficiency of a military unit. They immediately established a perimeter, securing the hazardous zones and mounting temporary security cameras on the steel scaffolding to monitor the site progression. Those camera feeds routed directly to a wall of monitors in my Portsmouth office. I sat in my ergonomic chair drinking black coffee and watching the digital screens. The resolution was crystal clear. I could see the heavy steel doors of my father's corporate office open. Harrison walked out onto the concrete floor wearing a tailored suit and polished leather shoes. He looked entirely out of place amidst the heavy construction equipment and the sprawling coils of thick industrial copper. I watched him pace the perimeter. He kept checking his gold watch, wiping a thin layer of sweat from his forehead. For 30 years, he had controlled every square inch of that facility. He dictated the schedules, the freight routes, and the vendor payments. Now he was a spectator in his own building. He tried to assert dominance, walking up to one of my lead engineers and pointing at a dismantled junction box. I saw my engineer hold up a hand, politely but firmly halting my father's advance. The engineer handed Harrison a bright yellow hard hat and gestured toward the yellow caution tape indicating that the client must remain behind the safety line. Harrison snatched the hard hat, his jaw tight with frustration. He retreated behind the yellow tape. He was stripped of his authority, forced to stand in the dust and watch strangers tear apart the archaic infrastructure he had neglected for decades. I zoomed in on his face. The stress was etching deep lines around his mouth. He was watching his salvation take shape, but the lack of control was visibly consuming him. By the end of the first week, the physical transformation of the warehouse was undeniable. My crews ripped out miles of degraded wiring and corroded bus bars. They installed sleek, modern switchgear capable of handling the intense thermal loads required by the biomedical buyers. The efficiency was breathtaking. Harrison had never seen tradesmen operate with such relentless mathematical precision. That weekend, Harrison and Sylvia attended a formal dinner at their local country club. The setting was a stark contrast to the gritty concrete of the job site. The dining room featured vaulted ceilings, heavy mahogany tables, and chandeliers that cast a warm golden light over the local elite. The air smelled of expensive grilled steak and aged scotch. Harrison sat at a round table surrounded by other wealthy business owners and real estate developers. He was holding court. He needed to project strength to mask the financial rot creeping through his foundation. He knew the rumors of his distressed property listing had circulated through the country club. He needed these men to believe the sale to the Cambridge biotech firm was a strategic triumph rather than a desperate bailout. Harrison leaned back in his plush leather chair and swirled the amber liquid in his crystal glass. He smiled a wide, practiced grin. He told the table that the incoming buyers had strict environmental requirements. He spun a narrative where he was the magnanimous seller, upgrading the facility out of sheer goodwill to finalize a highly lucrative deal. One of the real estate developers asked how he managed to secure an infrastructure upgrade on such a punishing timeline. The developer noted that the commercial supply lines were frozen and reliable contractors were booked years in advance. Harrison took a slow, deliberate sip of his scotch. He lowered his voice, projecting an air of exclusive knowledge. He told them he did not hire just any local electrician. He reached out to the premier engineering firm in New England. He dropped the name Apex Grid Solutions, letting it hang in the air. He described my company to his wealthy friends. He praised the flawless logistics, the elite crews, and the brilliant, unyielding executive management. He boasted that Apex Grid operated on a different level than the blue-collar laborers he usually dealt with. He tapped his glass against the table and uttered a phrase he loved to use when validating his own expensive tastes. "You get what you pay for," he said. The dramatic irony dripped from the scene like condensation on a cold glass. Harrison sat in a room full of millionaires using his remaining social capital to praise the sheer brilliance and efficiency of the very daughter he had thrown away. He was openly marveling at the architecture of a company built by the girl he told to go learn a trade. He believed he was praising a faceless corporate genius. He had no idea he was applauding the calloused hands of the child he discarded. Sylvia sat beside him, playing the role of the supportive, elegant wife. She wore her signature pearls and sipped a glass of white wine. When one of the wives asked about Julian and his software venture, Sylvia did not miss a beat. She smiled stiffly and said Vanguard was navigating a complex expansion phase in the Boston market. She lied with pristine posture, hiding the fact that her son was ignoring their phone calls while their family estate sat on the edge of foreclosure. They were drowning in toxic debt, but they refused to drop the performance. Back in my Portsmouth office, I did not care about their social performances. I cared about the data. The calendar ticked forward relentlessly. Day 30 passed, then day 35. My crews finalized the automated load balancing panels and ran the final diagnostic tests on the smart grid integration. The system communicated flawlessly with the high-voltage mains. On day 40, the municipal inspector arrived at the Concord warehouse. He was a strict, detail-oriented official known for failing commercial sites over minor infractions. I watched the camera feed as he walked the floor, checking the conduit runs, the grounding loops, and the thermal thresholds. He spent 4 hours verifying every single calculation. When he finished, he closed his clipboard. He pulled a green adhesive tag from his pocket and signed his name across it. He attached the green tag to the primary service panel, signifying a passed inspection. 10 minutes later, a digital copy of the signed certificate of occupancy landed in my secure email inbox. The report was flawless. 0 defects, 0 code violations. Apex Grid had executed an impossible 45-day turnaround with 5 days to spare. We had delivered the exact miracle Harrison purchased. I opened my corporate billing software. The system recognized the uploaded municipal certificate and automatically generated the final invoice for the Concord project. The remaining balance was exactly $150,000. I did not click send immediately. I opened my encrypted drive and pulled up the Vanguard ledger. I looked at the cascading red numbers tracking Julian's defaulted commercial loan. I knew the interest penalties had drained my father's liquid operating accounts. I knew Julian had exhausted the emergency reserves to fund his fake lifestyle. The family accounts were bone dry. Harrison had signed a binding contract agreeing to an accelerated 48-hour payment window. He agreed to forfeit his property lien if he missed that deadline by a single minute. He signed it, assuming he could delay the payment using his typical bullying tactics once the green inspection tag was secured. I looked at the flawless inspection report. Then I looked at the final invoice. The physical construction was finished. The copper was laid, and the panels were live. Now the financial execution would begin. I moved my cursor over the screen and clicked the button to transmit the invoice directly to Harrison's inbox. The 48-hour clock started ticking the second the email left my server. The trap was armed and the bait was swallowed. My father was about to open an email demanding a sum of money he no longer possessed to satisfy a contract he could not break. The work is done. But how will a man accustomed to taking whatever he wants react when he realizes he cannot afford to pay the final bill? The green municipal inspection tag hung from the primary service panel like a flag of victory. I watched the final walkthrough from the security feeds in my Portsmouth office. The executives from the Cambridge biomed firm toured the Concord facility wearing sharp winter coats and carrying digital clipboards. They scrutinized the heavy switchgear, the automated load-balancing modules, and the pristine conduit runs. They found 0 flaws. The lead buyer turned to my father and extended his hand. Harrison took it, shaking firmly. His shoulders dropped. The rigid tension he had carried for the past 40 days seemed to evaporate. He believed he had won. He believed he had navigated the impossible timeline, secured the biotech sale, and saved his 30-year legacy from the jaws of foreclosure. He walked back to his private office on the second floor of the warehouse, a man granted a miraculous reprieve. He sat at his desk and opened his laptop, ready to finalize the closing documents. Then the automated email from Apex Grid Solutions arrived. The notification chimed through his computer speakers. Harrison clicked the bold subject line. The final invoice loaded on his screen. $150,000 due payable immediately upon receipt of the certificate of occupancy. Harrison did not panic right away. He opened a new browser tab and logged into his primary corporate banking portal. He navigated to the emergency operating reserves. He expected to see a comfortable cushion of liquid capital ready to deploy. Instead, he stared at a ledger that had been bled dry. The balance sitting in the account was less than $14,000. The money was gone because Julian had taken the last of it. 2 weeks prior, while my crews were tearing apart the warehouse floor, Julian arrived at the Concord house with a fabricated emergency. He claimed Vanguard was facing a minor legal hurdle regarding intellectual property rights. He told Harrison he needed a swift bridge loan to pay a retainer for a high-powered Boston law firm. It was a lie. There were no intellectual property disputes because Vanguard owned no property. Julian needed the cash because his new wife, Lauren, refused to cancel their scheduled winter retreat to Aspen. She demanded the luxury chalet, the private ski instructors, and the 5-star dining she felt entitled to. Julian, terrified of losing the wealthy facade he used to trap her, begged his father for the cash. Harrison, accustomed to writing checks to cover his son's mistakes, transferred the final remaining drops of his corporate liquidity. He chose to fund a luxury ski vacation instead of preserving the capital required to save his own real estate. Now Harrison sat in his office staring at an empty bank account. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The biotech buyers were ready to close the sale, but the bank still held the pre-foreclosure notice. To clear the title and finalize the transfer, Harrison needed to pay Apex Grid. If he failed to satisfy the construction invoice, my company would execute the lien clause, intercept the property deed, and leave him with nothing. Desperation does a strange thing to a man whose entire identity is built on intimidation. It strips away his logic and forces him to revert to his most primal instincts. Harrison could not accept that his own financial mismanagement had doomed him. He needed an enemy. He needed someone else to blame. He picked up his desk phone and dialed the billing department for Apex Grid Solutions. The call routed directly to Bennett's office. I was sitting at my desk monitoring the accounts when the extension line lit up. I pressed the silent button on my receiver, lifting the handset to my ear. I listened to the sound of my father's ragged breathing before Bennett even offered a greeting. Bennett answered the call with his standard polished professionalism. Harrison did not bother introducing himself. He launched into a tirade. His voice echoed through the speakerphone, harsh and demanding. He accused Apex Grid of predatory invoicing. He claimed the total price was an outrage for the amount of labor provided. When Bennett politely reminded him that the cost was fixed by the signed agreement, Harrison shifted his strategy. He deployed the oldest trick in the commercial real estate playbook. He attacked the quality of the workmanship. Harrison told Bennett he had personally walked the floor and found the installation severely lacking. He lied with the practiced ease of a career bully. He claimed the conduit pipe was misaligned. He stated the grounding loops looked sloppy and the smart panels were not calibrated to his specific standards. He threatened to withhold the payment indefinitely, calling the entire 40-day operation subpar and unacceptable. He leaned into his leverage, assuming the contractor on the other end of the line was desperate for cash flow. Harrison demanded a revised invoice reflecting a 50% discount. He offered to wire $75,000 by the end of the week to settle the matter quietly. He framed it as a generous compromise, warning Bennett that if he refused, the payment would be tied up in litigation for years. I listened to my father construct this elaborate fiction. He was attempting to steal from the company that had just performed a miracle to save his neck. He was trying to force a stranger to absorb the financial blow of his son's Aspen ski trip. Bennett sat at his desk, resting a silver pen on his legal pad. He let Harrison exhaust himself. He let the shouting echo and fade into the quiet corporate air. Then Bennett spoke. His tone was perfectly level, stripped of any emotion or intimidation. It was the voice of a man reading a mathematical certainty. Bennett informed Harrison that the municipal inspector had awarded the site a flawless safety rating just hours prior. He noted that the biotech buyers had signed off on the infrastructure without a single revision request. He dismantled Harrison's lies about sloppy workmanship, using the state-certified documents as an impenetrable shield. Then Bennett delivered the crushing blow. He read the exact text of the accelerated default provision embedded in the contract Harrison had signed. He reminded my father that the final payment of $150,000 was due within exactly 48 hours. Bennett did not raise his voice. He simply stated the legal reality. He told Harrison that Apex Grid did not offer discounts. We did not negotiate completed contracts. We did not accept partial settlements. If the full amount did not clear our accounts before the 48-hour window closed, Apex Grid would execute the lien assumption. The property would belong to us. The biotech sale would collapse. The silence on the line was profound. I could hear the faint sound of traffic moving outside my father's Concord window. The illusion of his control shattered. He realized the faceless executive on the phone was immune to his threats. Harrison lost whatever thin thread of composure he had left. His voice shook with a mixture of rage and terror. He screamed into the receiver. He stated that nobody treated him this way in his own state. He swore he would drag the Apex Grid name through the mud and ruin our reputation across New England. He demanded an immediate in-person meeting. He refused to negotiate with the billing manager any longer. He told Bennett he was driving down to our headquarters first thing in the morning to speak directly with the owner of the firm. He wanted to sit across a table from the chief executive officer. He promised he was going to teach this CEO a brutal lesson about how real business was conducted. I sat in my chair holding the silent receiver to my ear. My pulse was slow and steady. Bennett looked toward the glass wall separating our offices. He caught my eye. I gave him a single slow nod. Bennett turned back to his speakerphone. He kept his voice smooth and accommodating. He told Harrison that the chief executive officer rarely took unannounced meetings with clients. He paused, letting the tension stretch. Then he offered the concession. He said, given the severe nature of the dispute, the CEO would make an exception. The CEO will see you tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, Bennett said. Harrison grunted a harsh confirmation and slammed his phone down, ending the call. The dial tone hummed through my office. I placed my receiver gently back on its cradle. The trap had snapped shut. The 48-hour clock was bleeding away. Harrison was gathering his remaining pride, preparing to drive south and intimidate the architect of his impending ruin. He intended to walk into a glass building and bully a corporate titan into forgiving his debts. He was bringing his wife and his golden son to witness his supposed triumph. The stage is set for the ultimate confrontation. But how will a man handle the realization that the person holding the execution warrant is the same girl he sent away to learn a trade? The sky above Portsmouth was pitch black by the time my staff went home. The heavy glass doors of the Apex Grid headquarters clicked shut, locking automatically. I stood alone in the center of the 10,000-square-foot facility. The space was a monument to the empire I built from nothing. The floors were polished industrial concrete, reflecting the pale blue LED lights from the server stacks, humming steadily in the adjacent glass-enclosed room. The architecture was cold, clean, and unforgiving. It was a physical manifestation of the exact principles that saved my life. I did not go home to my apartment that night. I stayed in the building. A confrontation of this magnitude requires the kind of preparation that leaves absolutely nothing to chance. You do not invite your predators into your home unless you control every single variable in the room. I walked through the silent corridors, my boots making a soft, rhythmic sound against the concrete. I went to the main boardroom. The space was designed to intimidate corporate executives. A massive $20,000 slab of dark mahogany served as the conference table, dominating the center of the room. 12 heavy leather chairs surrounded it. The far wall was made entirely of floor-to-ceiling glass, overlooking the dark, frozen waters of the Piscataqua River. It was a room where millions of dollars changed hands. It was a room where fortunes were made and broken. I walked to the head of the table. I sat in the high-backed chair facing the heavy oak entrance door. I closed my eyes and visualized the exact sequence of events that would unfold the next morning. I anticipated Harrison's aggressive posture. I anticipated Sylvia's patronizing attempts to smooth the tension. I anticipated Julian's smug, silent presence. They were going to walk through that oak door expecting to find an older, wealthy man they could manipulate. I needed to ensure the visual impact of my presence shattered their narrative before a single word was spoken. I did not call a personal stylist. I did not purchase a designer pantsuit or expensive leather heels. Trying to project their version of wealth would be a critical error. It would signal that I valued their aesthetic. It would mean I was playing their game on their terms. I refused to let them think their standards mattered to me. I laid out my clothes in my private office. I chose my signature uniform, a plain black cotton work shirt, devoid of any luxury branding. Clean, stiff, dark denim pants built for durability on a job site. My scuffed steel-toe boots, the leather scarred by years of climbing over rebar and concrete, and strapped to my left wrist my silver Casio watch, the watch that told me when my shift started, when the concrete cured, and when the interest accrued. I was going to wear the exact armor my father mocked. I was going to show them that the trade he despised built the mahogany table they were about to beg across. I moved to the technology array at the far end of the boardroom. I pulled down the massive motorized projector screen. I opened my encrypted laptop and linked it to the primary display. I unlocked the secure drive and opened the file labeled the Vanguard Ledger. The spreadsheet filled the massive screen, illuminating the dark room with an aggressive red hue. The columns detailed every single financial failure Julian had orchestrated over the last 36 months. The leased Tesla, the wasted marketing budgets, the exorbitant Boston rent, the predatory $500,000 commercial loan, the compounding interest penalties that drained Harrison's logistics accounts. The numbers cascaded down the screen, a brilliant, devastating waterfall of their own incompetence. I adjusted the brightness, ensuring the numbers were sharp and legible from the moment the heavy oak doors opened. I left the screen illuminated, casting a bloody glow across the polished mahogany. The ledger was no longer a secret tracking tool hidden in my cheap Manchester apartment. It was now a public indictment waiting to be served. The digital preparation was complete, but the trap required a physical anchor. I walked back to my private executive office. Behind a false panel in the custom oak shelving sat a heavy steel biometric safe. I typed my access code and pressed my thumb to the scanner. The locking bolt slid back with a heavy mechanical thud. Inside the safe, sitting beneath my commercial bonding certificates and regional municipal permits, was a single thin sheet of paper. I pulled it out. It was the original 529 college savings account withdrawal receipt. The document my bank mailed to me 3 years prior. It showed the exact date, the timestamp, and the bold black numbers detailing the transfer of $150,000 out of my educational fund. At the bottom of the page, it listed Harrison Wright as the authorizing custodian. I ran my calloused thumb over the printed ink. That single sheet of paper was the genesis of everything. It was the match that lit the fire. They thought the money was gone, absorbed by the Boston tech scene, and forgotten. They thought their theft was a buried family secret, a minor casualty on Julian's path to greatness. I carried the receipt back to the boardroom. I opened a standard yellow manila folder. I placed the withdrawal receipt inside. Next to it, I placed the formal legal notice of the commercial lien execution drafted by my corporate attorneys. The lien document authorized Apex Grid Solutions to seize the Concord Logistics Center deed upon default of the final payment. I closed the folder. I laid it perfectly centered at the head of the mahogany table directly in front of my chair. The staging was flawless. The red ledger glowing on the wall, the plain manila folder resting on the dark wood, the empty leather chairs waiting for their occupants. The conflict had officially escalated from a hidden Cold War to a scheduled public execution. I walked to the glass wall and looked out over the Black River. The current was moving fast, carrying chunks of gray ice out toward the ocean. I thought about the girl who dragged 2 duffel bags through the freezing Concord snow. She felt very far away. She did not know how to build a smart grid. She did not know how to leverage predatory clauses or outmaneuver logistics executives. She only knew she had been discarded. I was no longer that girl. I was the chief executive officer of the premier infrastructure firm in New England. I held the deed to my father's legacy in my hands. The 48-hour payment window was steadily ticking down towards zero. The morning sun was going to rise, and my family was going to get into their car. They were going to drive south toward Portsmouth. Fueled by arrogance and blind desperation, they intended to walk into this facility to teach a lesson about business. They intended to scream, threaten, and bully their way out of a legally binding commercial debt. They were walking into a room expecting to find prey. I checked the silver watch on my wrist. It was 4 o'clock in the morning. 5 hours remained before the scheduled appointment. I did not sleep. I sat in the high-backed leather chair at the head of the long table, watching the red numbers glow on the projector screen. I waited in the quiet building, listening to the servers hum. The trap was armed, the bait was taken, and the executioner was seated. How will the Wright family react when the faceless CEO they intend to destroy turns out to be the daughter they threw away? The morning sun hit the glass facade of the Portsmouth headquarters at exactly 8:45. I sat in the boardroom and watched the exterior parking lot feeds on my tablet. A sleek, black luxury SUV pulled into the visitor spaces. It was not Julian's Tesla. That car was currently sitting in a bank repo lot. This was a rented town car. My family was bleeding cash, but they still paid a premium driver to chauffeur them to a business meeting just to maintain the illusion of success. Harrison stepped out of the rear door first. He wore a dark navy bespoke suit. The tailoring was impeccable, designed to broaden his shoulders and project authority. He buttoned his jacket, adjusting his silk tie. Sylvia emerged next. She carried a pristine designer handbag, resting it on her forearm like a shield. She wore a tailored wool trench coat and her signature pearls. Julian climbed out last. He was acting as the designated heir, tagging along to support his father and look important. He wore a crisp, unwrinkled blazer. They stood in the parking lot for a brief moment, looking up at the sprawling 3-story glass and steel structure. They were attempting to perform wealth. They were putting on a costume of financial invulnerability. They did not realize that true wealth does not need to perform. True wealth is the silent concrete foundation they were walking on. They walked through the front automated doors at exactly 9 o'clock. The Apex Grid lobby was intentionally austere. The walls were exposed industrial brick adorned only by a single brushed steel corporate logo. Behind the reception desk sat a security coordinator monitoring the building feeds. Harrison did not bother checking in with the desk. He bypassed the coordinator, entirely operating on the arrogant assumption that the building should simply part for him. Bennett was already waiting near the corridor entrance. He wore his standard charcoal suit, standing with his hands clasped loosely in front of him. He looked like the seasoned corporate veteran he was, calm, detached, and entirely unbothered by the approaching storm. Harrison marched directly up to him. He did not extend a hand. He barked his demands the moment he was within speaking distance. He stated loudly that he was here to see the chief executive officer. He puffed out his chest, leaning forward to invade Bennett's personal space. He sneered and said he hoped the boss was ready to explain the predatory clauses hidden in their contract. Bennett did not blink. He did not step back or offer a defensive apology. He simply offered a polite, clinical nod. He told Harrison the executive was waiting for them in the main boardroom. He gestured toward the glass hallway, inviting them to follow. The walk down the corridor took exactly 40 seconds. I tracked their progress through the internal audio feeds wired into the ceiling. The acoustics in the hallway amplified their footsteps. The sharp click of Sylvia's leather heels contrasted with the heavy, flat thud of Harrison's dress shoes. I could hear Harrison breathing hard. The stress of the impending foreclosure and the physical exertion of his anger were taking a toll on his lungs. Sylvia walked closely behind him. I heard her whisper in her soft, placating tone. She told Harrison to stay calm and control the narrative. She reminded him that they were the clients and the contractor worked for them. Julian chimed in, adding that these construction firms always back down when faced with real corporate litigation. They were hyping each other up, building a fragile echo chamber of false confidence. They were walking deeper into the facility, admiring the sheer scale of the operation, feeling intimidated, but masking it with arrogance. Bennett stopped at the end of the corridor. He placed his hand on the brushed steel handle of the heavy oak boardroom door. He looked at Harrison one final time, offering a blank professional smile. Then Bennett pushed the door open and stepped aside. Harrison did not wait to be invited inside. He marched through the doorway blind to his surroundings, driven entirely by his rehearsed anger. He was staring straight ahead, focusing on projecting his voice before his brain could process the visual data in the room. "Now listen here," he began, his voice booming across the polished mahogany table. He pointed a rigid finger toward the head of the room, planning to launch into a vicious tirade about billing practices and vendor respect. Then the sound died in his throat. He froze. His outstretched hand hovered in the empty air. His vocal cords paralyzed. The rehearsed speech evaporated from his mind. He saw the large projector screen glowing red on the far wall, illuminating the Vanguard ledger. He saw the $20,000 table, and then his eyes locked onto the person sitting in the high-backed leather chair. I sat perfectly still. My calloused hands rested flat on the yellow manila folder. I wore my dark canvas work pants, my plain black cotton shirt, and my scuffed steel-toe boots. I did not smile. I did not frown. I simply looked at the man who had thrown me out into the winter cold. Sylvia stepped through the doorway a second later. She was busy looking down, adjusting the strap of her designer handbag. She did not realize Harrison had stopped moving. She walked directly into his broad back. The impact jarred her. She let out a small, annoyed sigh and stepped around him to see what was causing the delay. Her eyes swept the room. They passed over the glowing red screen and landed on my face. The reaction was instantaneous. Sylvia inhaled a sharp, jagged breath. It was a literal gasp echoing loudly in the quiet boardroom. The pristine posture she had maintained for 3 decades vanished in a fraction of a second. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin an ashen gray. The muscles in her legs surrendered. Her knees buckled beneath her, sending her plunging toward the concrete floor. Julian, who had just walked in behind her, lunged forward. He dropped his expensive leather portfolio and grabbed Sylvia's shoulders, catching her before she hit the ground. He hauled his mother back to her feet, supporting her weight. Julian looked panicked. He scanned the room, searching for the executive they had come to intimidate. His eyes darted to Bennett, standing quietly by the door. Then to Harrison, standing like a stone statue, and finally to me. His jaw dropped, his mouth opened and closed twice before any sound emerged. His brain scrambled to fit my presence into a logical framework. He could not comprehend the reality of the situation. He assumed I was a rogue employee, a janitor, or a disgruntled secretary who had wandered into the wrong room. "Madison," he stammered, his voice cracking. "What are you doing here?" The silence in the boardroom was heavy. You could hear the faint hum of the servers through the thick glass walls. The 3 of them stared at me. Their foundational beliefs about wealth status and family hierarchy were fracturing in real time. They were waiting for me to explain myself. They were waiting for an apology or a punchline. I leaned back in the heavy leather chair. I unclasped my hands. I kept my voice deadpan, entirely stripped of all anger, resentment, or triumph. I spoke with the clinical precision of a bank auditor reading a final balance. "I learned to trade Julian," I said. "Welcome to Apex Grid." The words hung in the red glow of the projector screen. Harrison stopped breathing. Sylvia's hands trembled against Julian's blazer. The shock had landed, shattering their armor and exposing the terrifying truth of their situation. The girl they discarded was not scraping by in the dirt. She was the executioner holding the deed to their salvation. The trap had closed, but the financial dissection was only just beginning. How will a family built on lies react when the silent shadow CEO delivers the final fatal blow? The paralysis holding my father hostage finally broke. He blinked rapidly, trying to force the current reality to align with his outdated perception of the world. The cognitive dissonance was too heavy for his ego to bear. Instead of admitting defeat, he attempted a clumsy, desperate pivot. He straightened his spine, pulling his shoulders back and tugging at the lapels of his bespoke suit jacket. He forced a tight, artificial grin onto his face. He looked around the pristine boardroom, admiring the dark wood surface and the expansive glass walls. He told me it was an impressive setup. He said he always knew I had a knack for tinkering with mechanical things. Then he deployed the most manipulative tactic in his arsenal. He assumed his paternal authority still held weight. He ordered me to cancel the outstanding balance. He waved his hand dismissively at the digital invoice, stating that since I owned the infrastructure firm, the debt was simply an internal accounting error. He looked me in the eye and said, "Family helps family." Sylvia nodded eagerly from her position leaning against Julian. She smoothed the front of her trench coat, trying to rebuild her shattered dignity. She offered a weak, trembling smile. She told me she was so proud of my little business, and that we could all go home and celebrate over dinner once this silly paperwork was resolved. I did not return her smile. I did not acknowledge my father's order. I picked up a small black remote resting on the table. I pressed a single button. The projector's motorized lens shifted focus. The red spreadsheet dominated the wall behind me, the Vanguard ledger. I directed their attention to the data. I began reading the mathematics of their ruin. I kept my vocal cadence even rhythmic and relentless. I told them that 36 months prior, a specific financial transaction occurred. I pointed to the top cell on the screen, $150,000 withdrawn from a protected educational fund to finance a software application. I highlighted the revenue column for that venture, a column containing nothing but zeros. Vanguard produced no product, acquired no users, and generated no income. I tapped the remote again. A new column appeared adjacent to Julian's failures. The Apex Grid corporate gross revenue over the identical 36-month window, $22 million. The numbers glowed in bright white, contrasting sharply with the bloody red of their debt. I watched Harrison's eyes track the figures. He was a businessman who understood gross margins. The sheer scale of the wealth I had built while he was hemorrhaging cash hit him like a physical strike to the chest. I brought the final data point onto the screen, the construction invoice for the Concord Logistics Center. I read the total aloud, exactly $150,000, the precise numerical equivalent of the stolen seed capital. The universe rarely balances its scales so perfectly. But I had engineered this specific symmetry. I placed my hand on the yellow manila folder resting in front of me. I flipped the heavy cardstock cover open. I slid the contents across the smooth mahogany surface, stopping directly in front of my father, 2 pieces of paper. The top sheet was the original bank receipt from the 529 savings account, bearing his authorizing signature. The second sheet was the formal legal notice of commercial lien execution drafted by my corporate attorneys. I looked directly into Harrison's pale face. I told him I was not clearing the invoice. I stated that the 48-hour payment window had officially expired. I informed him that I was executing the default provision. Apex Grid now held the primary encumbrance on his commercial real estate. I was taking the warehouse. Julian could no longer hide behind his parents. The reality of his own uselessness cracked his polished facade. He stepped forward, releasing his grip on Sylvia's arm. He slammed both of his hands down onto the expensive timber. The impact rattled the crystal water glasses sitting near the centerpiece. His face flushed a deep mottled crimson. He pointed a shaking finger at my face. He screamed that I could not do this. He accused me of orchestrating a malicious setup. He yelled that I was trying to steal their building out of petty jealousy. He called me a thief. Before I could respond, a harsh mechanical buzzing sound interrupted his tantrum. Julian's smartphone was vibrating violently inside the breast pocket of his blazer. He tried to ignore it, but the ringing persisted, a loud, obnoxious digital tone piercing the tense air of the boardroom. He reached into his pocket and pulled the device out, intending to silence it. He glanced at the notification on the illuminated screen. His eyes widened. He turned his head, looking past me toward the floor-to-ceiling glass windows overlooking the visitor parking lot. I did not need to turn around to know what he was looking at. I already knew the schedule. Through the thick glass, the winter sun illuminated the asphalt below. A heavy-duty flatbed tow truck bearing the emblem of a regional repossession agency was idling directly in front of the main entrance. A man in a high-visibility safety vest was currently attaching thick steel chains to the front axle of a sleek white Tesla Model S. The red expired registration sticker on the rear plate was clearly visible even from the second-story window. The commercial lenders had finally tracked down the defaulted vehicle. Julian stood paralyzed, watching the hydraulic winch activate. The heavy steel cables pulled taut, dragging his rented status symbol up the metal ramp of the tow truck. The tires squealed against the cold asphalt, a faint sound penetrating the insulated glass of the boardroom. His facade of tech wealth was literally being hauled away, leaving him with nothing but an empty blazer and a mountain of toxic liability. Julian stared at the empty parking space, his chest heaving. I looked at his defeated posture. I addressed his previous accusation. My voice cut through the silence, cold and absolute. I told Julian I did not steal anything. I reminded him that they approached my company begging for a miracle. I stated that Harrison signed a legally binding commercial contract outlining specific deliverables and rigid payment schedules. I noted that Apex Grid delivered flawless engineering securing the biomedical sale and honoring every single clause. They failed to pay the debt. I informed him that executing a legal remedy for a breached contract is not theft. It is the definition of accountability. I was simply seizing the asset. Harrison collapsed into one of the leather chairs. Sylvia covered her mouth to stifle a sob. Julian remained glued to the window watching the tow truck merge onto the highway. The illusion they had maintained for 3 years was entirely shattered. The numbers on the projector screen offered no sympathy and no extensions. The math is undeniable, but what happens to the family now that the ledger requires payment in full? Harrison sat slumped in the leather chair, his hands resting on his knees, trembling. The fine fabric of his bespoke suit seemed to sag around his shoulders. He looked like an old man. The illusion of his control was broken permanently. He stared at the yellow manila folder and the withdrawal receipt resting on top of it. He finally understood the architecture of his own downfall. He had constructed the trap himself. I simply provided the paperwork. I looked at my father. I did not feel the need to raise my voice. The truth does not require volume to be heard. I told him he did not bankrupt himself over a grudge. I said he bankrupted himself by betting his entire legacy on a son who produces nothing and discarding a daughter who builds everything. The words settled into the quiet air of the boardroom. Harrison did not argue. He had no arguments left. His checkbook was empty, and his leverage was gone. Sylvia stood beside him quietly, weeping into a tissue. Julian remained near the window, staring at the empty parking space where his stolen lifestyle had been hauled away. I turned my gaze toward the heavy oak door. Bennett stood near the threshold. I gave him a single brief nod. Bennett opened the door wide and signaled the 2 uniformed security coordinators waiting in the corridor. They stepped into the boardroom with practiced professional detachment. Bennett politely informed the Wright family that the meeting was over and requested they exit the premises. There was no dramatic resistance. The fight had been drained out of them. Harrison stood up slowly, using the edge of the mahogany table for support. He did not look at me again. He walked toward the door, his head bowed. Sylvia followed closely behind him, her designer handbag hanging limply from her arm. Julian was the last to leave. He picked up his empty leather portfolio and walked out into the hallway. The heavy oak door closed behind them with a solid metallic click. I watched them walk down the glass corridor on the security monitors. They did not speak to each other. They took the elevator down to the lobby and exited through the automatic doors. Julian had to ride back to Concord in the rented town car with his parents because he no longer possessed a vehicle of his own. They faded from the camera feeds, leaving my headquarters exactly as they found it, cold clean and operating at maximum efficiency. The financial aftermath was swift and clinical. My corporate attorneys filed the executed lien notice with the Merrimack County Clerk before noon. The legal encumbrance was lifted from the bank and transferred directly to Apex Grid Solutions. We assumed the primary position on the deed. Harrison was officially stripped of his commercial real estate. The warehouse no longer belonged to him. With the title cleared under my corporate umbrella, I contacted the Cambridge Biomed firm. I informed them the electrical upgrades were certified and the property was ready for immediate transfer. We closed the sale 3 days later. The biomedical executives wired the purchase funds directly into the Apex Grid operational accounts. The sum covered the initial predatory loan, satisfied the construction costs, and left my company with a staggering net profit. The capital was clean, untethered, and ready to be deployed into our next regional infrastructure expansion. The loss of the logistics center triggered a cascading failure across my father's remaining assets. Without his primary warehouse, Harrison's supply chain business folded within a month. He could no longer store inventory or dispatch freight. The revenue dried up instantly. Because he had leveraged his personal assets to float the compounding interest penalties on Julian's debt, the banks initiated foreclosure proceedings on the Concord estate. The large house where I grew up, the house with the faulty electrical panel and the warm fireplace, was seized and auctioned. Harrison and Sylvia were forced to pack their remaining belongings and downsize into a cramped 2-bedroom rented condo on the outskirts of the city. Sylvia stopped attending her country club luncheons. She could no longer afford the membership dues. Julian's descent was even steeper. The facade of the wealthy tech founder shattered the moment his bank accounts were frozen. Lauren, his entitled wife, filed for divorce the same week the repo truck hauled away the Tesla. She packed her designer labels and moved back to Boston, leaving him with a stack of unpaid credit card bills and a hollow corporate registry. Julian was forced to abandon his leased seaport office. He moved into the spare bedroom of his parents' rented condo. Having no actual skills, no technical degree, and no work ethic, he faced a brutal reality check in the job market. The visionary entrepreneur ended up taking a retail position at a local shopping mall. He now spends his days standing behind a glass kiosk wearing a polyester uniform shirt, selling protective phone cases and extended data plans to passing teenagers. He scans barcodes for minimum wage while standing on his feet for 8 hours a day. I did not attend the foreclosure auction. I did not drive past their rented condo to gloat. I did not send them a message or call them to demand an apology. Revenge is an emotional pursuit, and I operate strictly on data. The ledger was balanced. The debt was paid in full. There was nothing left to discuss. On a quiet Friday evening in late December, I finished my paperwork at the Portsmouth headquarters. I locked my office and walked out to the parking lot. The winter air was crisp and biting. I climbed into the cab of my white Ford F-150 pickup truck. I turned the ignition and felt the engine rumble to life. I merged onto the northbound highway, leaving the city behind. I drove for 2 hours, watching the dense urban lights fade into the dark silhouette of the White Mountains. The road wound higher into the tree line, surrounded by deep snow and tall pines. I turned onto a secluded gravel driveway. At the end of the path sat a beautiful timber cabin resting on a ridge overlooking a frozen valley. I had purchased the property with the initial profits from the lakefront smart home contracts. It was remote secure and entirely mine. I parked the truck and walked up the wooden steps. I unlocked the heavy front door and stepped inside. The cabin was dark and freezing. I walked to the utility closet and opened the primary breaker panel. I ran my thumb along the plastic housing, admiring the precise routing of the heavy-gauge copper wire. I had designed and installed the entire electrical grid myself. I flipped the main relay switch. The lights hummed to life instantly, bathing the room in a warm, amber glow. The baseboard heaters clicked on, pushing the cold air out. I walked into the living room and lit a fire in the stone hearth. I sat in a leather armchair, watching the orange flames consume the dry wood. The silence in the cabin was profound. It was not the tense, heavy silence of a boardroom or the bitter silence of an unheated garage. It was the deep, earned silence of an empire at rest. I looked down at my hands. The calluses were still there, thick and rough. I traced the edge of the silver watch on my wrist. I was 25 years old. I owned my infrastructure. I owned my property. And I owned my peace. When they tell you you are not enough, do not argue. Just build a ledger they cannot afford to pay. Drop a comment below if you have ever let your success speak for itself. Subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. There is a specific kind of quiet that falls over a home when trust is finally and irrevocably broken. It does not sound like shattering glass or screaming voices. It sounds like the click of a front door closing behind a young woman walking out into the freezing snow with nothing but 2 duffel bags and a stolen future. When we look back at the ashes of the Wright family empire, we are not just looking at a story of corporate revenge or a brilliant financial trap. We are looking at a modern American tragedy about the catastrophic failure of parenting. It is a cautionary tale about what happens when the people tasked with guiding us choose their own egos over the fundamental duties of fairness, honesty, and love. In American culture, we place a massive premium on the optics of success. We are deeply seduced by the pitch deck, the tailored suit, and the confident smile. Harrison and Sylvia Wright fell victim to this cultural blind spot. But their failure was much deeper than a bad financial investment. They committed the ultimate parental betrayal. They categorized their children not by their character or their work ethic, but by how well they fit into a preconceived traditional narrative. Julian was the golden boy. He possessed the sleek vocabulary of a tech founder and the unearned confidence of a son who had never been told no. Madison was the gritty reality. She had grease under her fingernails and a mind built for mathematics and heavy infrastructure. Harrison looked at his son and saw a reflection of his own vanity. He looked at his daughter and saw manual labor. He allowed his traditional bias to blind him to the truth, sitting right at his kitchen counter. True family responsibility requires a parent to see their children clearly, evaluating them on the merits of their integrity rather than the polish of their presentation. By funding Julian's delusion, Harrison did not just steal Madison's money. He robbed Julian of the one thing every young man desperately needs to survive in the real world. He robbed him of accountability. When you hand a child a fortune they have not earned, you are not giving them a head start. You are handing them an anchor and throwing them into the deep end of the ocean. Julian collapsed because his parents built a fortress of toxic enabling around him, shielding him from every consequence until the walls finally gave way. They thought they were expressing love, but they were actually cultivating incompetence. True long-term guidance means allowing your children to fail. It means letting them feel the harsh sting of a missed deadline or a depleted bank account so they can learn how to build themselves back up. Then there is the issue of profound dishonesty. A college savings account is not just a ledger of liquid capital. It is a physical manifestation of a promise. It represents decades of sacrifice specifically earmarked for the betterment of the next generation. When Harrison drained that account to fund a fake app, he severed the root system of his own family tree. Fairness in a household does not always mean dividing every dollar equally, but it absolutely demands a baseline of mutual respect. To steal from the child who works for the benefit of the child who coasts is a violation of the most sacred parental oath. It teaches the hardworking child that their labor is worthless, and it teaches the entitled child that the world exists solely to be exploited. We must also examine the quiet, devastating role of the enabler. Sylvia represents a failure of emotional awareness that is tragically common in traditional family structures. She saw the theft, she saw the pain on her daughter's face, but instead of defending the victim, she chose to protect the illusion of peace. She told Madison not to make things harder than they had to be. In doing so, she taught her daughter that the comfort of the aggressor was more important than the survival of the injured. Emotional awareness in parenting does not mean smoothing over every conflict with a forced smile. It means having the courage to stand in the uncomfortable truth. It means holding your spouse accountable when they cross a moral line. And it means defending the child who is being wronged, even if it shatters the perfect image of the family dynamic. Madison survived because she stripped away the emotional validation she used to seek from her parents. She took her father's brutal insult and forged it into armor. But a child should never have to become a cold, calculating machine just to survive their own family. A home is supposed to be the sanctuary where a child learns the blueprints of trust and empathy. When the sanctuary becomes a war zone, the child learns how to build fortresses instead of bridges. Madison won the war, but the tragedy remains that the war ever had to be fought. She gained an infrastructure empire, but she lost the ability to look across a Thanksgiving table and see people she could trust. Raising children in today's demanding world requires a fierce commitment to honesty, even when it is uncomfortable. It requires parents to reward the grit of the calloused hand over the smooth promises of the silver tongue. We must teach our children that true wealth is not the car they lease or the title they print on a business card. True wealth is the competence they build in the dark when nobody is watching. If we fail to teach them this reality, the world will eventually teach them for us, and the market is a far less forgiving teacher than a loving parent. If this story resonated with you, or if you have ever had to build your own sanctuary from the ground up after being underestimated by the people who should have believed in you the most, please take a moment to join our community. Follow the channel Luke Vengeance. We share stories that explore the hidden architecture of family justice and the quiet power of outworking your critics. As we close this chapter, think about the foundations you are pouring in your own life. Look at the people sitting at your dinner table. Are you rewarding their character, or are you funding their illusions? Are you speaking the hard truths, or are you just keeping the peace to avoid the storm? We spend our entire lives building legacies hoping they will stand the test of time. But sometimes late at night when the house is completely quiet, you have to wonder, are you building a home that will shelter your family, or are you just assembling the ledger that will eventually tear them apart?